Hello, everybody. Wonderful to see you all here tonight. Isn't it a beautiful night to be out on the patio with this breeze? Perfect. Uh, I'm so pleased to be here to hear from this wonderful group of graduate students and to thank everybody at the museum for all they did to really install, I think, a beautiful show. And Don Fuller, who's in the back, had a lot to do with collaborating with Sarah Howard and the School of Art and Art History and the grad students and writers and everybody, Stanton Store, to produce the catalog. So we put one out. If you don't already have one, please take one. So this exhibition is so important to our program, and I hope important to the graduate students, where they have an opportunity to work with professional museum staff in terms of installing and knowing what the value of your work is for insurance purposes and filling out loan forms and condition reports, etc. I know all that paperwork sounds silly, but it's good that you get rehearsed before you go on with your careers. So it's my pleasure now to introduce to you Leslie Elsasser. She's our Curator of Education, and very interesting background herself in terms of travel and as an artist, and doing a great job as our Curator of Education.
Thank you, Margaret. So, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. I want to echo Margaret's appreciation to Sarah Howard, who is the interim chair this year at the Fine Art College of Art and Art History, and also to the faculty who have led the artists through the third year of their graduate work, which is no small feat, and I'll tell you about that in a second. And I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. We love having you, and thank you to come and listen to what the artists have to say about their work. As Margaret said, my name's Leslie Elsasser. I'm Curator of Exhibition. I'm going to moderate this conversation tonight. Before we begin and I introduce all of these amazing artists, I'd like to thank my colleagues, because to put something on, even if it seems simple, takes work. So I'd like to thank Margaret Miller, our director. Thank you. Randall West, our deputy director. Don Fuller and Mackenzie Farrell, our new media curator, and our graphic designer who did these beautiful catalogs, who are also recording tonight. So give them a round of applause. I'd like to say thank you to Gary Schmidt, Eric Jonas, and Alejandro Gomez, who are here in the audience. Say hi for this gorgeous plein air setup. We're outside thanks to them. To David Waterman, who's our sound man tonight, plus. He does so much. Give a wave, Dave, back there. And to Tammy Thomas, who's here. She's our event coordinator, and for all of her help. She's kind of been the right-hand person behind this tonight. So let me tell you what tonight's format is. So I'm going to briefly introduce each artist and their work, and then we're going to open into a conversation. Please think about your questions for the artists. We're going to have Q&A after. If you'd like to ask them a direct question or a question to any of them, we'll have a mic for you. So kind of think about what they're talking about as they discuss their work. If you have not had a chance to see the exhibition inside, please do. It closes on Saturday the 4th. That'll be our last day, May 4th. It's an extraordinary exhibition. They've worked really hard all year with their professors, their committees, to make this look professional and to make it look easy, which is no small feat, I must say. So I'd like to extend the warmest welcome to all of them. Please help me congratulate them. So I'll tell you who they are, and without further ado, I'll begin. We have here on my left, Tanner Simon, Mason Dowling, Ainaz Alipour, Tisha Benson, K Sharma, Amber Toplisek, Andrew King, and Carolyn Colby. Welcome. So thank you for being here, and thank you for letting me do this with you. I feel really honored and privileged to do this with you. So I have to look at my questions. All right, we're going to start with Tanner. You ready, Tanner?
Hello, thank you,
Hi.
Leslie, for having me on the show.
Thank you for being on tonight's show, Tanner. I want to tell you a little bit about Tanner's work. He's a painter, and his work falls really into the history of painting in many ways, but he seeks to recontextualize cultural truisms and common knowledge into icons and significance. His paintings are monumental in scale, meaning they're really large, and he questions notions of representation, power, and meaning. So, Tanner, you talk a lot about scale in terms of power, the heroic scale of your paintings, how that affects representation, how that affects interpretation, right? But it also seems that color and value, and for those who are not artists, value meaning light and dark, are key, as you say, air quotes, moves in your paintings. So, in terms of that strategy to convey power and meaning in your paintings, could you talk about your color considerations and your strategies and how you use light versus dark? And I'm thinking specifically about large clam, small clam, and then also still life, which is the big painting inside that's black, all around a circle of an articulation of a sort of still life in color. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, this kind of goes to my origin story. I did a lot of plein air painting, thousands of plein air paintings, and that was my practice before I came to Florida. And I had this run in with David's Napoleon crossing the Alp, and that's kind of maybe where scale first comes into my vocabulary as a painter, because I realized that, like, wow, it's a very imposing painting, and it's very authoritative, and it's supposed to have like some kind of pride for um, imperial France. And then when I did my own copy in the museum, I realized how like floppy and powerless my version was, and the colors weren't as intense. So that was kind of my step into the door of like, I'll make a scale copy of Napoleon crossing the Alps in the way I was working, and that's when it got back some of that power that the small sketch lost. So that's kind of entering like definitely where scale comes into place. And in terms of color, like from all of those plein air paintings that I've done, and all the observational paintings, I started to really pay attention to how to mix paints, and I mix all of my own colors. Um, Very rarely do I actually like mix the paint from pigment, but I buy large quantities of paint, and then I spend a couple days for each painting mixing certain colors and color matching, and then tubing it. So each color is kind of based on what I've observed from nature, and also I use MS Paint, Microsoft Paint software, and 3D Paint that comes equipped on any standard Windows computer since way back. And I'm really interested in those color combinations that are kind of preset, the color combinations in like a box of crayons. So I pull from all of these little bits to kind of decide which color is is the simplest and most accurate for what I want to convey. So instead of doing a bunch of different colors that make up something, I kind of try to study like what is the one blue that is the sky. Because if you look up now, like not here, but over there, there's many blues in the sky. So if you had to like summarize what is like the one powerful true blue, that's kind of how I think about color and how I approach it.
So it's interesting in big clam, small clam, if you squint the values, there's not a lot of difference between light and dark. It
Hmm.
shifts in color. But if you look at still life, you really create drama with scale and your value shifts. Will you talk
Yeah.
about that?
So with big clam, small clam, I was kind of thinking really about the different hues of color, and in terms of like the value being the same, I really love like Monet's impression sunrise. Thinking about like how the
Interesting.
value is all the same, and that's something that I've really come to appreciate. Like being able to make something that does have contrast, but not between dark and light. It's just the color is so yeah, that's something like a little treat that I kind of throw in there. And in terms of still life, I was trying to kind of pack an entire painting into this tiny, the tiny area. So I did want that contrast, and I did want like if you look at the apples versus like the table, those are the same value, but because one is like a blue and the other one is this like really glossy kind of satin red, it has that what otherwise would have been like a light dark, but it still has that pop out and that resonance.
It's
to
so
it.
interesting how you do it because the painting in color, in still life, if you haven't seen it, is like this circle, this small circle on this big canvas, and the rest is black. So it looks like the painting part is really small, but it would never have the same impact without surrounding it with that sort of absence of color.
Well, and that's why scale also kind of comes back in because, yeah, if it was just a normal still life painting, it would be like maybe like a square 2 by 2 feet or something, or a round canvas. But then, like you have to reckon with this giant empty kind of void. So the idea behind it was like if you had a flashlight and you're looking through your house and it's like at night, I don't know, like I use my phone flashlight a lot and it's kind of terrible and it only kind of shines like directly in front of you a little bit. So I was kind of just thinking about that, and then you're left with just like no information, or it's really blurry, or it's hard to kind of perceive anything. So for the black, I used black 4.0, which is Culture Hustle's kind of rip off of Vanta Black. So I was kind of trying to push like how much of a void we could make without needing to steal someone's intellectual property.
To your point, that's really interesting because that idea of illumination without creating light and shadow in a painting is really hard to achieve, but that's your inspiration, yeah? Interesting.
Yeah.
I kind of want to talk to Mason about his painting. So how I line this up, you guys, is so if you go in the gallery, we have painting, we have mixed media, we have different medias. I'm sort of going along the line of similar processes, or at least similar medias. And Mason Dowling, he did a series, and it's in the gallery over here, called An Alphabet. It's 22 process-based acrylic paintings. They're all acrylic, correct? And they're identically sized. And Mason said they build layered histories of contact into a sense of individuality and specificity. So when we were talking, we had a conversation. When we were talking, you said that each painting's not meant to be or equate to a letter of the alphabet, correct? But more like a vocabulary of tools. And you talked about tools as processes and ideas, which was really interesting. But I can't help wondering, and this is what I really have been dying to ask you, what if you took some of those different processes, those different vantage points, the different multi-layered histories, and put them into one large-scale painting? Would that change the syntax, or would that change the way the paintings are in dialogue, and therefore you're in dialogue with the painting? Would you ever experiment with something like that?
So I do make big paintings too.
Okay.
But I think for me, there's like a difference that kind of comes down to density. So like the small paintings have this kind of feeling of compactness and density. I think of them kind of like batteries, like they can hold a lot in a small space. But I think big paintings are kind of expansive in their nature, and they have like a different bodily reaction than coming up to this little thing that's packed full. But in terms of bringing kind of like different ideas from paintings together, I do that, and I'm also very careful about that. We had a lecture here last year by Lisa Yuskavage, and she said this thing that really stuck in my head, which was like, she was like, I'm going to diagnose all of you painters, like your problem is that you have too many paintings in your painting. So when it comes to like bringing in to a piece different kind of ideas or processes, I think, you have to be really careful, like almost scientific about like what are the variables I'm dealing with here. And like, every piece I try to kind of take things out, actually. Instead of bringing ideas together in paintings, I'm always kind of trying to pull them apart into more paintings so that I can really get to like a painting that's addressing something particular.
That's interesting. Lisa Yuskavich would say that because her paintings seem to be paintings within paintings within paintings. Very funny.
It's a rule I really want to break too, of course.
How so? Like, how do you want to break that?
Well, I
Meaning-
mean, I think it's interesting to think about like how much can you pack into a painting, how much like Hieronymus Bosch, right? Like there's like so many paintings within paintings, but they're all in a very particular material language, and I think that is something for me that like each piece needs to have its own kind of way of being, and that kind of comes down to the material.
So then, and then I'm going to go back to Tanner to see what you think about this. So then, when you have the 22 paintings, almost well, they are equally spaced, almost like a staccato, rhythm going down. Do you think they relate differently to one another and to you as a creator than they would if they were in dialogue in the same painting? Like, how do you think they operate?
Like if they were one piece that was kind of
Or several
tiled
were
out,
one
or-
piece? How do you think they operate when they're next to each other, installed in this kind of line?
Well, I think the first thing we do when we see like a line of things is we try to form a narrative out of that sequence, right?
For sure.
I have a lot of fun when I put these together trying to take that out to make sure there's no transitions that you start to just like read a narrative.
Okay.
It's really fun to just break it up so that everything kind of feels as different as possible. Yeah.
And how do you deal with the idea? Because when you're a painter, you can't ignore, unless you're working in black and white, right? The idea of color. It's always a consideration. How do you deal with color?
I think primarily, I think about color as like a way to cover things up.
For example,
Like a way to react to things. Like I'll start a lot of paintings by doing something to the gesso when I prime them. Maybe put some ink in or blot them on something just to kind of get things going and get something specific, even if it's not something I like, so I can start to be in conversation with it. So I think of color as a way to really respond to what I see and also to subvert it. But every time I add color, right, it's like covering up what's underneath it. So that can happen, hundreds of times in a painting.
and do you pull through that so some of it speaks to the other?
Yeah,
Moods
sometimes.
in
I
your
mean,
paintings?
I think a lot of painters get attached to things in their paintings and try to kind of preserve them. Mostly that really brings the paintings down, I think. Like we all kind of go through this. You have this little artifact you're trying to protect, and it's really kind of the problem in the painting. But like going through that process and then eventually kind of sacrificing those things, I think gets you somewhere else. But yeah, there's fragments. The sides of the paintings accumulate a lot of evidence. Like you're like, whoa, where's that color in the painting? You're like, oh yeah, it's like way down.
It's interesting you said that, because that was something the poets talked about last week, was extracting those extra things that they're in love with, but that are crippling the ultimate work that they made, or their spoken word. How do you think about it like this? How do you think about this idea of taking everything out? Do you think about that, or do you think about adding things in? Because you're very much a narrative painter.
Well, I think I'm maybe not a narrative painter.
Really?
And I'll explain that a little bit.
Please.
And I work for the most part in maybe the opposite way that Mason works. I meticulously plan out all of my paintings ahead of time. I do my own drawings, and then I'll take it into MS Paint or something like any primitive software. I don't like design the whole painting in MS Paint, but I use it to kind of map out what colors I want, or if I'm going to put in a 3D object or something, and then I'll compile a bunch of references, and yeah, I'll make studies, but I'll typically do them either like sketch-wise or digital paint-wise, and then and not like in a Jeff Koons paint by number sense, but I have a certain set of processes that I work with, and similar to Mason, maybe I do have like a vocabulary that I work within, and I even have Tanner's scale of visual information.
I saw that.
Yeah, so it's just a little chart, but it starts with like raw canvas to gessoed canvas is number 2, and then number 3 is like a turpentine wash. So it kind of goes up, like they're very basic like paint moves. Alla prima is one of them, and glazing, sfumato, dry brushing. So I kind of think about like using maybe 3 or 4 of these moves, and they're all very different, and they all create a lot of tension between each other. So when I'm planning a painting, I'll consider like what is going to happen, and then I'll follow through with these processes. In one regard, like my painting is about some of those processes and the tension it creates, and it's also about like how you interact with the scale. And I know we talked a little bit about yellow grouper, or maybe we will.
We
so
will.
I don't.
We
I'll
might.
save that.
We'll see if
we'll
we
go
have
back
time.
to that. But I feel like I'm missing a part. What am I missing? What do
Well,
we-
I'm just really.
all the things in the painting.
Yeah,
Yeah,
adding
so-
rather than subtracting, because it seems like you have very different
Well,
approaches.
and we do agree, like the Lisa Yuskavich thing. I mean, I'm interested
That's
in
so
getting
interesting.
something very simplified and iconic and recognizable, and almost maybe too simple. Whereas like the image of the painting, the narrative, is kind of just this like very friendly introduction, and then like you kind of, if you keep looking or if you interact with the painting or you experience the scale of it, you get a different experience than just kind of the narrative. And that's what I'm interested in. Like if you look at the painting from like 20 feet away, it looks kind of like an MS Paint sketch. It's very small and pleasant, and it's once you kind of approach it and experience the physicality of the painting in space is when you kind of understand what the painting is about. So I think the narrative is maybe just like a MacGuffin.
A draw me in, look
yeah,
at me.
just a handshake.
A handshake. Oh, I'm gonna.
Yeah.
We'll go back to that.
Or
I
a fist
wanna-
bump.
Or a fist bump. Okay, post COVID. Ainaz, I want to ask you. First, I want to introduce your work. So Ainaz is in the back gallery over there. She has the installation, and she's a multidisciplinary artist, and she's also a filmmaker. And Ainaz says she's driven by a deep sense of social consciousness. She seeks to comprehend her transnational identity, and we'll talk about that in a second, and unravel the untranslatable nuances of being in multiple places, multiple cultures. You're from Iran, correct? So her work encapsulates the interplay between external perceptions and internal complexities. So, and tell me if I'm pronouncing this wrong, because I've never said it out loud. Sarat is the name.
So it's Muasharat.
Mosharat.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so I wanted to have like a Farsi title for my work, although like one of the narrative is in Farsi as well. But so the work is about like what it's kind of like my self-portrait as I immigrated to United States close to 5 years now, and it was kind of like my meditating on like the aspects of how I experienced my life here, and the meaning of the Farsi word is like if you look it up in like in the English Farsi dictionary, it says like socializing. But the real or the deeper meaning of the word is like about spending time with like your loved ones, and it's just for like spending time with them for the sake of just spending time with them. And that's kind of like what I wanted to happen for the viewer as they experience my piece, no matter if they know the meaning of the word or what, but as you know, as long as they go through the work and opening up the pockets and spending time with like the time-based media within the piece, they're spending time and get to know the work.
Well, let's talk about that, because if you haven't experienced her work, she's got sort of allusions to body parts. They drape from the wall, they stack, they're prone on the ground, they overlap, they come out of the corner, and they all occupy space like this, but they're in the external world, right? But for me, when I was talking to you, and then when I spent time in the gallery, they beckon you in with these external sort of secret pockets. They might have videos in them, they might have details in them, and they sort of reveal these little details like an advent calendar or something. But what I noticed most when I spent time with it is that everything seemed to be from the perception of a place inside this fabric corporal body, right? Everything. And it was almost as if you place a viewer, even though we're in the external world, looking outside with you. And I found that really interesting, because when we talked, you said it was like a skin opening up and stories coming out of bodies, which I found so interesting because, and I have to tell you truthfully, when you were talking to me, the first thing I thought of was this film. I don't know if you've all seen it many years ago, being inside John Malkovich's head. And I thought of what that perception was like, that filming was like. And would you talk about this idea of not only living between the two cultures, but how do you, now that it's installed, experience it yourself? And how do you think viewers experience being inside and outside, weirdly enough, at the same time, because it's palpable? I feel that very much in your work.
Yeah, so I guess after like moving to US, I kind of like perceived my body like my homeland, and it was like because I don't have physical access to the home, back home country, and so that's like how I perceive my being, and I want to share it. And I mean, my first project for my MFA was like this 3D virtual reality animation, and I was like, I want to do this because I want to put people through my perspective, throughout my body, and see the experience. And as I went through the program, I started to like add tangible elements to my work, and that's how it's happened. And I was thinking about like making this body out of the place, or making this place out of the body, and yeah.
Making a place out of a body?
Yeah.
What does that mean? What do you mean?
So, all right. So I have multiple characters in the piece, and I'm thinking about like how this event is happening throughout all these stories related to all of these characters, which are like kind of anchoring me here and connecting me to the people from back home, or like that's how I look at it. But I can expand more if you have any specific.
No, that's really interesting because when I experience your work, I feel like, and you said something so interesting to me one day, I feel like you put us in a vantage point from your eyes. And yet, because you suck us in, like we open things, we enter things. But when you said Pippoletti Reese videos and that one in PS1 in the floor, I went, holy moly. Which is extraordinary. Have you guys seen the work inside? There's this one piece where you're looking at the videos, but you're placed in a place where you're looking out at the world from the vantage point of the artist. How do you read that now for the viewers? Is that kind of how you wanted them to experience these narratives?
I guess it's like this. There are these opening points through the body that you can reach in, like with your hands, with your eye, looking at it. Especially we are talking about the piece on the floor, like going literally with the camera through my body, and that's like the story is there.
So this experience of being multinational in different places, you're not literally at the same time, but experiencing memory, presence at the same time. Is that how you talk about your narratives from these multiple and characters' multiple points of view?
So like I guess living at the time that we are all living, throughout the day we have to like compartmental, like divided our thoughts and our experience and our being throughout the day through like social media, like thinking about what's happening at home or at work. And but like after I literally like immigrate, after the immigration, it gets like suddenly really, really exaggerated for me. And suddenly I start thinking about it a lot, like how I'm juggling my experience between like different time zones, or like and funny thing, like all of my best friends are in United States, but we couldn't manage to move to same city. So I'm connected to them through the cell phone all day, and try to thinking about the place that they are and how they experience their being. And it's like it's more exaggerated comparing to what it was before. And yeah.
And you feel that distinctly in your body.
Yeah, that's how I experience it or think about it. Yeah.
That is so interesting. I'm gonna, Tisha, if you don't mind, I'm gonna go to Harsh first, because I think there's a lot of similarities in your work. and then we'll come back to you. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is K Sharma. His exploration and experimentation with different materials is integral to his process. He's from India, and I'm going to say a quote that you said. He said, moving abroad gave me a totally, all capitals, different perspective, yet expressing concepts at the convergence of different cultures and histories has been challenging. And he seeks to create a bridge between these vastly different experiences. And I'm going to describe your work before I ask you a question, because we're going to sort of go back to this conversation about being in multiple places experientially at one time. So have you seen Harsh's work, The Big Dog, in our entry gallery? Right. And the name of it is Dobi Kakara. Translates loosely, and you could correct me, to a laundryman's dog. Correct?
Yeah, it's like Dobe ka kutta, a
Dobi
laundryman's dog.
Kukuta, a laundryman's dog. So, and I'm going to paraphrase, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, all right? To give you the context, it's a Hindi expression that means literally or metaphorically neither here nor there. And the references to the street dogs in Surat, correct, that are tended to by people, but no one in particular. And they sleep outside at homes, they're cared for, but that's only during the night. During the day, they will follow the washerman to the ghats, to the washing places, and spend the day with them. But the risk is when they return home to their adopted home that no one really owns but tends to them, another dog might have usurped their nighttime sleeping quarters, and then they find themselves without a home temporarily. And they go homeless until they find another welcoming and available outdoor place. So the expression alludes to the liminality being caught between places without a clear sense of belonging, correct?
Yes. So, like, first of all, it represents.
We'll
my-
talk about your work in a
Oh,
second,
okay.
but let's talk about,
Yeah.
did I get that paraphrase right?
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
Okay.
That's correct. But like, not just in Surat, but in overall India.
In
It's-
all of,
yeah.
right. And I've experienced that in India too. The dogs are not cared for, but they don't belong to anybody.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've talked quite a bit, and you have a similar experience also of being in two places at one time, but the way you express it seems a little bit different. And could you talk about how you did this sculpture, this large monumental dog-esque sculpture, as both a representation of that concept, but also as a self-portrait?
First, about the size, like, I made the same sculpture really small scale, not beyond like 6 inches. And the posture right now, like, it came from that previous piece only. So my idea was like, I made it like a couple of semester back, and I placed it so low on the wall so that the top of the nose comes to your knee. So when you are looking at the sculpture, it looks like the dog is looking at you. And like, that always happens, like whenever you are petting a dog or something, like they always looks at you. And like, they are just looking at you, like they are just seeking for like love and care and something like that. And that was the same idea, like, I started that. I tried to keep that piece like more like a victimized situation, like liminality, but I'm like victim of liminality. But when I scaling it up, like, it totally changed the meaning of it. It becomes more powerful. Like, initially, the audience was dominating that sculpture, but now when you are entering and you are like seeing that really big 15-foot dog, the piece itself dominating you. Like, you can walk underneath and you have to like look up to see the dog face, but dog is not looking at you. Like, that period or that portion, like that feeling is gone. Like, now it becomes like more powerful, and that's why like I added more like humanish features like hands muscularity, and like the posture of the hands, that taking that, like the pushing the chest upside. So
But
yeah.
so we're going to talk about that, but it's it's that laundryman's dog being nowhere, right? Being sort of neither here nor there. So it's that sort of parable, that expression, that idiom. But you told me it's also a self-portrait.
Yeah, it is a
How
self.
how did you mix that? Like what is happening? It's a little like the sculpture we just talked about, but yours is different. It's not soft, it doesn't have video, but in some ways it's a story.
Yeah, so like it is a self portrait, as it is representing me and my situation, my emotion. So in that manner, it is a self portrait, and like I tried not to keep it more the idea of like the actual kind of like the self portrait that people are looking to. Like people have the idea of like if it is representing myself, like my replication, but I tried to make it more like a representing my own situation, my own emotion.
So like a Naz, you feel kind of in two places at one time. Or that you don't belong in either place anymore.
Uh, Actually, it's both thing,
Yeah.
because right now I'm here, but I'm not sure if I'm going to be here in the future, and if I'm going back to my country, everything is like changed, because when I came here, my way of like my style of working was totally different. After I came here, like it changed totally. And if I'm going back to India, somewhere again I have to start from the scratch. So that's why I'm like somewhere in between, like I belong to nowhere.
It's interesting. We'll talk more about the dog if we get to. I have other questions, but I want to go to Tisha. Tish. So Tisha Benson, she does sculptural works that grow out of ever-expanding and diverse collection of materials. The materials range from those with functional purposes to manufactured materials with a large range of uses. And I'm going to tell you what I found so interesting about what you wrote and talked about in your work. It seems like your practice begins with the materials, and you almost tend to them carefully. You observe them, and they're unconventional, you said, potential. So you're allowing them almost in this anthropomorphic way to reveal themselves, or that's kind of what it feels like when I talk to you or when I've heard you talk about them. And you write, and I'm going to quote this, I try to relate to the objects on their own terms in a way that seems them as they are and not as what I expect them to be. And for me, you seem to actively be pruning your own editorial thought process as much as you're observing them be what these materials will grow to be. I find that really interesting. And you wrote, because I have no interest in imposing a structure upon something or subjecting it to an alteration for which there is no instigation. And I think you mean from the material, correct? So my question is this even possible? And if it is, how can you circumvent your own perceptions and your own taste? Or can you? And if you can, how do you do this?
So I start with material, and the first thing that I do is try to identify what the potential is in a material, the things that it's capable of physically, through manipulation, identifying like different formal cues, color, shape. And then beyond that, also trying to identify the things that materials do outside of what is originally assigned to them. So these things all were made with a specific purpose in mind. And I think the part that gets me away from my own like force in the situation is by identifying the things that the materials could do that I'm not necessarily expecting.
Such as, can you give us an example? Because if you haven't seen Tisha's work, it's over in the gallery this gallery over here on the floor. They're two bodies of work. They're tall and the others are low to the ground. And one is called Full Fathom 5 and Little Sea Change, which I'm going to talk about. Yeah. Can you tell, like, how do you do that? Like you said, you tend to them in your studio, you look at them, you play with them. What do you do? So there's an intervention. It's not like you're just waiting for the secret whisperer in your materials to come to you and say, I want to be a circle, right? You have a process you go through, yeah?
Right. So it's that process of testing limitations, seeing like what is the most that I can do to this material before it will break, how far can it stretch apart, you know, and looking for, like I said, the cues and things. So are there holes that are a specific size? What is the diameter? For example, in Full Fathom 5, the PVC that the like long linear elements are made out of was originally in hoops, and it was punctuated by these holes. And in trying to unbend that hoop, I ended up with these like irregular bends. It has these like notches that are the result of responding to the material in its like particularities.
So this is a question you might not even have thought of. I'm going to ask it, and I don't exactly know how to articulate it. But we all have a kind of taste, right? And it's as natural to us as breathing. We don't even think about it. When you're looking at these materials, do you have a lens through which your taste gravitates? Like I noticed in these your two beautiful bodies of work that they have a similar color. They have a certain aesthetic that's really sensitive. And you talk about they come from an ecosystem. And in some ways, for me, they seem so biological. Do you have a certain taste or aesthetic that you gravitate towards your materials, with your materials, even though they're sort of, you're experimenting, you're letting them be what they need to be, and you're looking for these clues?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I don't even know how to articulate
I think
that.
there are a lot of
It's a
answers.
feeling.
I'll try.
Okay.
Yeah, the coming from an ecosystem, the studio is the ecosystem because things are evolving alongside each other. They end up with these like interwoven like material investigations. So they share their evolution together. And then I think in terms of maybe like innate aesthetic, I think it really comes down to attention and intention, trying to be really thoughtful about every decision that I make, like second guessing the easy moves or the ones that come really naturally. Because I find that if you're really present and you're, you know, taking notice of all of the different things happening, you are able to see possibilities that are generated, you know, beyond what you expect to happen. So I think that the attention and the intention is what makes that aesthetic happen.
So interesting, because I love how you talk about your work in this really biological way. Like ecosystem, this intention, this thing that happens, how the materials sort of reveal themselves. It's a very interesting thing. I'm going to go on to Amber, because I think in some ways you share a lot of similarities. I don't know if your approach does, but this is Amber Toplisek. Let me get your introduction to your work. And Amber thinks about the network of images that exist within her. She embeds once immaterial images, meaning images from the ether, images on the internet, intangible, concrete structures. Her intention is to amplify the image's potential to coalesce into the viewer's physical body and act as a web for ideas to be held. And I'm going to approach this question a little bit from the sort of same perspective, because in some ways I think you work in a similar sense, but also very differently. So, for one, I want to tell you, I love how you talk about the image of the flower in your work. I absolutely love it. And you said in one of the writings, it was subjected to a life cycle, confined to the screen. And that was before you cribbed it from the internet, which is kind of a violent burp. You just took this thing. You write that they, and I think you mean the images, fester and grow inside me and ultimately act as mnemonic spaces for ideas to manifest. You also wrote that the network of these images, the cumulative network of these images, exist within you, and they act as an imperceptible alchemy that bonds and bends me toward its will. So I take that meaning the immaterial images seem to open new idea spaces for you while bonding and bending you to their will. So I'm intrigued by this lack of boundary between the living and the non-living, and the transference of an image that metaphorically jumps species from internet world to you, inside of you, and to environments, and that it is so much power to create spaces in you, and these ideas, a space to manifest your living ideas, and how these inert images act upon you as a live being. Could you talk about what this network of images inside you look like, or might look like, and how they inspire these creative spaces for you? Like I actually see them, or from what you've written, that you see them as these actual spaces.
Yeah. I don't know if I necessarily see it or visualize specific images. I think they've kind of coalesced inside me, and like it is kind of imperceptible that I can't distinguish my own body from what I've seen. It kind of becomes, there's like a relationship of kind of what you were saying with the living and then the non-living. So yeah, I'm really interested in that kind of relationship and the duality of how we kind of both interact with each other and influence each other. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things going on. I think about the body a lot in my work and kind of how images influence me. I do have a practice of going and looking for images online and kind of choosing what speaks to me and kind of letting the image affect my body and like become almost a mnemonic way to remember a feeling or a memory. They're very intimate spaces for intimate metaphors. Personally, the flower specifically is kind of representative of a very intimate space and moment in my life, and I'm kind of trying to use the image as like a way to quickly get back to that place. I think too about digital images and screens a lot in my work, and it's almost like I think a lot of us could relate, but my phone is really like almost an extra limb at this point. Like I, have a lot of images saved and kind of go regularly to my camera roll to kind of access this network, I guess you could say, as well. It's kind of like a living archive, personal, that kind of gets re-embedded and redigested over and over again, and then kind of eventually evolves into the work that you see.
Okay, I'm going to go off a little bit and ask you a question, because if you haven't seen Amber's work, it's the work inside that's glass, almost like stained glass with these images embedded in it. Will you talk a little bit about your choice to disrupt this idea of photography and embed it, and I think that's what you mean, tangible structures, something concrete in the world, not just an image floating on the internet, but you embed it in these really solid forms that are so beautifully, I know you don't think beautifully, but beautifully put together with this lead, and they're just gorgeous. They cause these shadows. They're in very unusual shapes. Would you talk about that idea of using those images with glass and why you decided to make this as a photographer?
Yeah, I mean, I think I got a little bit frustrated with the medium of photography and kind of the flatness that it naturally possesses, kind of like just there's very specific things that a photograph should kind of be flat, and like the edges and touching it gets crinkled. And I guess for me, I wanted like this tangible structure to hold the image in place, and more, it kind of goes beyond just the image that's represented as like a flower. And I kind of wanted to create a space for almost whatever image comes to mind for the viewer when they're physically in contact with the piece. So I'm using a lot of elements like it's kind of that are related to the photographic medium, like glass, which was traditionally one of the first materials used in photography to kind of capture and hold a negative image, and metal, which is also embedded in like a historical sense of analog photography. So thinking about those materials specifically holding an image to kind of allow for an experience that goes outside of one image and kind of maybe can encompass an idea of an image or, yeah.
It's interesting because in some ways I relate to your work in the same way I relate to Tanner's work in this historic process. You talk about the historic processes of photography. You're very self-aware of your lineage and where you're putting yourself in the contemporary conversation, as I think you are as well with your idea about, you could tell me if I'm wrong, but your idea of where you situate yourself in the history of painting. Do you guys feel like there's, because you seem to be doing very much that. You wrote about how you try and disrupt the image in photography. And I took that to mean you're really, and that was a little bit painful for you. But you're looking for, you said, I struggle with doing that. How you're looking for finding that place in the contemporary dialogue, as I think maybe you are too. Do you guys, does that resonate at all?
Yeah, yeah, it does. And like specifically, I kind of make myself struggle with trying to create very flat color fields with oil paint, and it doesn't want to be flat. It doesn't mind being in a color field, but it doesn't want to be in a flat one. And mine are really only flat if you look at it like straight ahead, and then the edges start to interact with the light in a certain way, and you can see the brush marks. But yeah, it's kind of this drive to fit into the canon of like traditional oil painting that has kind of inspired me to keep using that. And I think the end result is like more vibrant than anything else you could use. Like it's more, the colors are more intense, and the surface is kind of really sexy compared to if it was acrylic paint. And honestly, if I had a place to get really dirty, I would probably be doing fresco on plaster. But I've tried it, and it's very, very difficult. So that's something for the future.
That's so interesting. And I think in some ways you're doing the same, like you really honor that history, but finding out, because we're in a digital world, how is that history relevant, right?
Totally. And I think another like overlap is kind of this intention of the experience that we want to kind of allow the viewer to have with the work, and kind of think about that maybe their relationship with painting, or their relationship, the viewer's relationship with photography more intimately, I think, and kind of utilizing those techniques in a way that kind of can ask those questions, I would say. Would you agree?
Okay, I'm back. So I think something that maybe we're both also dealing with is like there's such an abundance and commodification of images, and we're always bombarded with them, like on our phone. And I know for me, like it's important that it's a painting. It's important that it's like massive, because you can take a picture of my painting, but you'll never get what the painting does if you're just looking at it. You need to actually be there. And unfortunately, very few people actually get to experience the work. But I mean, that's similar to what you're doing. It's like the object, and where the object is the artwork, and you can't just like show somebody or take it with you. It's not just another thing you can scroll through. I mean, you can scroll it because we both post our work on Instagram, but it's its own thing. And
Yeah.
I know that's why I make work, because it's so like demoralizing, and it kind of makes images lose any kind of power or meaning in my mind. Like looking at a photograph now, it's so hard for me to feel anything now. It's just like looking at grass or something, which I think is interesting, but
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think one way I specifically kind of try to have that experience is kind of using I use privacy screen protectors on some of my pieces that kind of allows for an experience to happen while you're walking past, and kind of allowing the image to come into focus and out of focus, and kind of that's like a very bodily relationship that wouldn't be seen not in person. So yeah, I think that's.
Can I tell you how much I love hearing this conversation from your generation? Makes me so happy. Keep making. And I'm going to ask Andrew, because you are a maker's maker. I want to introduce Andrew King. For Andrew, the potency of his art objects lie in the collision between process and objects. Assemblage and collage are paramount, whether in ceramic, sculpture, or painting. If you haven't seen his installation, it's in the entry gallery right in front of the doors. And so, as I said, I think this is perfect because you are a maker's maker, and you make a lot of work. And when I came to your studio, one of the things I thought, or just struck me, is that you seem to think through process. It's kind of different. You sort of lay things out and think through that translation. You seem to be working in a very different way through the process, much like, in some ways, I would say you do. But what I was thinking about in your studio and here, how ultimately the artwork relates to each other. So I want to ask you, in this installation of multimedia work, you have ceramics, you have painting, you even have a sculpture. And I want to ask you about the work together. Is it a sort of composition for you or a collage for you, sort of the sum total of parts? Or could you talk about that relationship, how that's working for you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. I think of them very different pieces. I wouldn't install them that way. I would
Really?
separate them. The Juice Box of Desire should have its own room, or like be in a room with other towers, but I wouldn't intermix in that way. That was just a limitation of group show settings.
Why, though? Why, reading your work now as it is?
I mean, I understand where you're coming from, and there was a time that I was interested in the environment that the works together created, and like the piece, the Peddling My Wares, the like ceramics collection, that is a piece, it's a singular piece composed of multiple parts. So that piece in itself like is a collage, but I didn't want them to be dependent upon each other. I kind of think it's more interesting having an interaction between a body, a space, and like a singular object, rather than having to connect the object and the space into like one interaction.
That's interesting, because I think, Tisha, you had the same feeling, like they were two separate bodies of work. They weren't, yeah, right? Sure. You had the same, because when I heard you talking about your work, and there was a question to you at a point where, are they one body of work? And you were absolutely adamant about no. And you didn't want them to be read that way.
Yeah, they're definitely separate pieces.
But they don't relate for you guys in any way because you use similar colors. No.
Yeah, well, I mean, my whole process is in similar colors. Like, everything I do is pretty much a couple colors. So they're definitely related, but no, I don't like, I'm working on those independently. The composition of the piece is in the piece. It's not in the, like, conjunction with other works.
Okay, will you talk about it? Because you mentioned to me last night, in fact, that collage is really important to you. Will you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, collage, so I've changed mediums and materials quite a bit in just developing an art practice. And collage has sort of been the one through line. Some of it is this love of finding objects, and I mean, the collage for me for a long time hung out in 2D work. So it was this idea of images as objects, finding them. You get to dig through history. You have these other associations with these images than they existed with in time. Like, I love collage. And then sculpture introduced found objects. But it's always this combination of multiple parts. And I kind of think it's like what everyone is saying with that, like, their reality is fragmented, is I think that our reality is fragmented. And I think it makes a lot more sense to try to represent feelings that maybe align more with abstract art than image-based art through a sort of collage combination of experience rather than like a pure image.
Could you give an example of how you do that in your ceramic, one of your ceramic works?
Yeah, I mean, some of the ceramics for a while, I was literally like collaging objects onto them. There's a couple pieces in there where I was doing that, and that was kind of breaking that like 2D, 3D imaging collage as an object. I mean, I don't really think of like building a vessel, they're pretty singular. They're not really like collage in that way. But I do find, especially like in that installation, the arrangements of them, that has collage parts. I started like stacking stuff, and then you just get these sort of formal situations through the associations of different materials that you weren't having beforehand.
That's so interesting because for me, you have a particular aesthetic. And it could go from, and I've talked about this, and it's something I love in your work, because you are a very serious, mindful artist. I've talked to you a bit. Yet, you have this familiar kind of Dr. Seussian or Pippi Longstockings aesthetic that sort of belies your way of thinking seriously about your work, which I know you do, because for one, it's in the work, and for two, we've talked about it a little. And there's, for example, I'll give you an example for the tower. It's this neon orange. It's sort of wonky. It's got a big juice box on the top, but then it has these chains, which are not for the weak of heart on it. Would you talk about your aesthetic just a little bit?
Yeah, I am very serious about art. I take it very seriously, and I think it's important, and it means something. But I also think that too much serious in art is really self-righteous and kind of annoying. And so I don't want to do that. And art movements like the Chicago Imagists, the California Funk movement, they showed me like satire and how, I mean, those movements are extremely political, but they're all going through humor and like banality in order to make statements on serious things, which I think like as an audience, we don't want to just get preached to. We would rather be able to develop like our ideas in our own head. And like that's the goal with an art object, is to just like start the process of thinking. I don't want to like give someone a thought.
Agreed. I love that. That you're not didactic, but you like a little node of starting somebody's own process.
Yep, that's the goal.
But I love that aesthetic because I grew up with Pippi Longstockings and Dr. Seuss, and they were just what it is for you guys in your digital age, and we're going to talk to Caroline about your influences, but that was very much my aesthetic as a little kid.
Yeah, I mean, I love like the fantasy world mixed with like a decorative aspect. Like, yeah, I'm there for it.
I love that. Caroline, let's talk about yours. This is Caroline Colby. She's an interdisciplinary artist whose work focuses on creating parallel worlds through the eyes, ears, and bodies of characters that reside within her worlds. She borrows from her love of PlayStation, anime, graphic novels, manga, and horror indie games. I don't know what those are, but we're not going to ask that now. There is so much I'd like to talk to you about your work, but I'll ask a few of my most pressing questions. Something I discovered which isn't relevant, I found when you were talking about your work, you were talking about your characters recently and you about your work, and you said they carry multiples. I carry multitudes. And I thought of this Walt Whitman poem, and it's called The Song of Myself. Can I paraphrase it a little bit, or just this one stanza, 51? It says, "Listener up there, what have you to confide me in? Look at my face while I snuff the sidle of evening. Talk honestly. No one else hears you. I'll stay only a minute longer. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes." I thought so much about that in terms of your work, but you said you had never read that poem. Is that correct?
Yes,
I just
that's
learned
correct.
this.
Yeah.
But do you think it resonates in any way, this largeness of your characters, of Walt Whitman sort of talking about the grand I, not himself, but the I as humans and as these big feelings, like these big feels and experiences. Could you talk about that a little bit in terms of your work? Does it resonate at all with you?
Yeah, the poem is actually very fascinating. I just see my role, just as an addendum, I never expected myself to get into animation. That was the last thing I ever wanted to do because it's so tedious and hard. And in order to make just one movement, there's so many hours if you want to polish things up. And so, in a sense, I'm aware of animation and its history because of my consumption of manga and Japanese animation, and even to an extent video games design and things like that. But I see myself as both the god of the world and the resident fragmented. Like, I am affecting myself and everybody is affecting me. And there's this conversation between myself as the person who orchestrates everything that's on the screen and the person who is basically experiencing what I am exposing myself to on the screen. So in a sense, it's like the multitude is my potentiality as a person with responsibility and with agency in my work. And then there's also the lack of agency or the sort of having somebody give me something that maybe I don't want. And so maybe that conversation, I don't know if that makes any sense, but.
It makes perfect sense because Walt Whitman was talking, I only took one stanza, 51, but he was talking about something very, very similar about how the world is all inside him, but yet in all people. Mm-hmm. And it's this sort of symbiotic experience.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to know, when I look at the things that I make, it's hard to know where I begin and where the characters that I make end, because they sort of seem, it becomes, for me, and this sounds very insane, but it becomes so vivid in my mind. Like, I literally hear noises. The noises that I pick are because I hear certain sounds, and then I try to find them. I see certain visuals. I try to recreate them. So in some ways, I'm not that creative because what I'm thinking of is on the screen, but at the same time, there's like a physical reaction or mental conversation that I'm having that I'm trying to birth into the world through these images, through these animations.
So you really know these characters intimately.
Yeah.
I think like Amber said, intimately you know these images. You really know these characters.
In some ways I know them, but just like when you know someone, there's so much more to a person. Like there are such, there's a meme online about icebergs, and that's like a common trope where it's like music, I love this, and shoegaze farther down the thing, and noise music all the way down the iceberg, and it gets crazier and crazier. And it's just like that with people. Like, if every time I think I figure out someone or myself or something, like something comes up and it's totally unexpected. And it's like these characters, in some ways, they always surprise me because I'm always surprising myself. I'm always surprised by people. I'm always surprised by life. And in some ways, it's just like a tiny attempt at grabbing the surprise by life, like in these multiplicities and these images and these animations.
Do you collect your characters? Do they evolve?
They evolve even though I don't want them to.
Really? You sometimes want to suppress them?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Like,
can't they go in a timeout box or something?
I mean, no. They're freaking crazy. I don't know what to tell you. It feels like I'm wrangling a bunch of children, and it's like, or cats, or dogs, or maybe they're all three at the same time, and it's really hard. And I feel like I'm a sheep herder and a sheep and the dog and the cat at the same time. It's very chaotic. So sometimes I solidify myself in a position in relation to these characters, but it's a little difficult.
Well, we'll send them to school so they learn how to behave. So for time's sake, I have so many more questions, but for time's sake, I want to open it up to the audience for questions. And you could ask the artist questions, you could ask general questions, choose who wants to answer it. What questions do you have for them? Nobody?
I was just curious about the title of your show. Keep the Rabbit. I Keep the Rabbit.
It's from a song by the Uranium Club. The Uranium Club.
What is that?
It's a band.
Oh, well, that's good to know. Okay,
Yeah.
I thought it was like some Fortune 500.
No,
Okay.
they're a little punk band from Minneapolis. It's but there are people in life who are climbing the social ladder, and then there are people in life keeping the ladder clean.
Oh, and we have to distinguish. It's a good title. I was wondering the same thing. Who else has questions? Yeah.
Did you ever make the, was it a fridge or a pantry? Like the idea that you had mentioned at your show at the Howard Gallery?
Howard Blake, the Hell's
Yeah.
Kitchen show.
Yeah. Did you ever manifest that or get that into, curious?
Yeah, so what that's in reference to is I call it like the Ron Gorchoff zone. On the column paintings, there's this like exposed area. It's the back of the painting. The columns are, it's basically like one painting, but it's like an inverted panorama, a column, so you can't experience the whole painting at once. Like it's not one image, it's several different areas you need to be in. And in the back of it, you can see the structure. And one of the things I wanted to do with it is just kind of an experiment is like, what if I built like a pantry inside of it? Because it does kind of feel like a refrigerator or something. And I'm not sure how that fits into my practice or if that's just me wanting to play around with the object of it. Like maybe I just want to build a refrigerator in general. I do a lot of things. Like I'm a tinkerer, I do painting, I make film and video. So the big paintings are just because I have a big studio now, but I do love painting. But yeah, I might make a refrigerator / painting at some point in the future. But I have not yet.
Tuned. Stay tuned. Alicia, you had a question.
Yeah, it's actually it's more curiosity. I'm used to
Put the mic near you.
I'm used to looking at art, and the next thing that I usually do is look for the title that the artist had. And I noticed that Mason lists the ones that are here in the book. None of them have titles. They are all untitled. My question is there a reason for that?
Well, I think a lot of what I'm trying to do is sort of get beyond words and language a little bit. But I am interested in finding titles for them. I just struggle with it. And no matter how like sexy of a title I come up with, it's hard for me to feel that it actually improves the experience of looking at the painting. So there are some that have titles like written on the back, but I think that's sort of, it's almost, I don't mind keeping that kind of private. You know, if somebody like has one of the paintings, maybe they'll know the title.
That's so coy.
But you know, really, yeah, it's kind of a struggle because everything I do is sort of opposed to language and symbolic meaning. So then trying to like stuff it back into that feels very unnatural. But I've thought about collaborating with people on that. You know, like I think there's people that do what I do with paint with words. And so kind of outsourcing that part of the process to somebody else is a little bit appealing to me. Getting somebody who's a poet or maybe like a linguistic specialist to kind of come up with language for it. Because it's, I don't know, I think getting really good at working with language seems like as much of a time commitment as painting, and I have my hands full. Thank you.
So my question is, do you know when to stop? Do you know when to say to yourself, this is perfect as it is? Or do you come back to it the next day and you continue to work on it and then it morphs into something you don't like or you didn't expect? Can you comment about that?
I know for me, I go into a piece, I kind of work in ideas. So I'll have an idea about something and it'll be like, maybe it's about like soup in the night, like when you wake up in the middle of the night and it's really hot, or you can't fall asleep on a hot summer night and you're all sweaty and you're like, well, maybe I'll eat something and go to sleep, and then you're like alone in the kitchen and it's like kind of dark and maybe somebody's like watching you from the window but you can't see out so you don't know but it feels like it. So like I'll start with like that idea, or in Yellow Grouper it's like something really close up so you can't really see what it is, like your hand, it's abstract. And I'll have an idea about like what physically needs to happen on the painting. And then I know when it's done because I have an expectation of like how many layers of paint have to go on it, or and when it's opaque enough and when it's vibrant enough. For me, it's very straightforward. It's about like getting the idea, and there's no real doubt like, oh, well, this layer, you know, it's flat and blue and it's what I wanted, but maybe it needs something else. It's like, well, that would be a different idea. Like when is a house done? You know, you could keep adding things to a house. Like how many cabinets does the kitchen need? Like 50, 60? I mean, probably like 5 or 6 maybe. There's only so much space in the kitchen for cabinets, and when the space is done, then you don't keep adding cabinets. You don't add 3 refrigerators. So it's just kind of how you think about like painting. I'm very familiar with painting, and for me, I know what I need to do to finish it, because it's like building a house for a carpenter. I mean, that's how I think about it. I don't know if anyone else has any other ideas.
Does anybody else want to respond to that?
I work in the unknown a lot. I don't know what I'm doing. And I think that like getting better at art is learning when to make the decisions on like what to leave and what to cover. But it's always a process, and I'm figuring it out every time.
All right, everyone. Will you? Oh, I'm sorry. We have one more question. I'm so sorry.
Hi, okay. Thank you so much for the wonderful work. My question is about the material, and at which point you decide on which material to use? Like, how does conceptualization with materiality kind of come together?
I was thinking of you, Amber.
For me specifically, I'm working with materials of, kind of glass and metal. It's coming from like a stained glass process. So I'm really interested in like the history of the materials, and kind of, I even think about stained glass a lot as kind of being almost the first time the images were seen backlit. If you think about like historically in churches, there's light coming through them. And I relate that a lot to kind of seeing digital images on your phone screen kind of being illuminated from the backside. So yeah, I think I kind of come from a kind of historical lens, I guess you could say, and I'm choosing my materials, specifically glass, metal, and then kind of historically stained glass and images for a very specific reason. That kind of, does that answer your question? Okay, yeah.
I think, Caroline, that's a good question for you, too, because you've only shown this work, but you have so many materials you work in.
Well, I guess for my work, I specifically chose tablets, partly because they're seen as forms of entertainment that are sort of mindless, but wherever we entertain ourselves, we find ourselves, even if we don't want to find ourselves. So in a sense, a tablet is like a representation of a confrontation or a revealing of yourself. I also think about tablets as entertainment, as like for games. The kids play on their iPad, they play random on apps. I think about the duality of, you know, fantasy and horror, because, you know, they could be, anyway. But I'm definitely thinking about games. I specifically reference an 80s video game called Mystery House that was for the Apple II computer. It was by Roberta Williams. It's very bare bones. It's just line drawings of interiors of houses and objects. And so in the same way, I wanted to keep that same just simplicity of line and color in order to create a psychological space, because it wasn't about making a physical space. It's all about psychological spaces. It's all about mental spaces. There is no place. The place is us. We're the place that things are happening. So that's why I used tablets and I used projection, because digital things tend to relate to the psychological a lot easier. But I have done costumes, I've done performance, I've done sculpture. It really depends on how I'm trying to convey whatever character is possessing me at the time, so to speak. So yeah, hopefully that helps.
Thank you for your questions. We'll take one more, and then we do have to close. Yes.
Just like a quick fun question about like the lifespan of artwork. So like the pieces you guys have in the museum right now, like how long would you like them to last? Like ideally, how many generations should interact with the pieces, or do you not care?
My pieces are 100% archival and will last 4.5 billion years if kept in this consistent, proper humidity.
I think they'll probably see us out, and my concerns are more about our own archivalness as a species, honestly.
Anybody else? Would you take one last question? Did you have a question? There's one last one, and then I'll call it.
What are the most important tips you would give to young artists starting out, whether it's in the production of art or how to get involved in galleries and selling work?
It's a good question.
Does this one work? Yeah. Find people who are doing what you want to do and just figure out how to be in that bubble and just learn from them and just pick up on tendencies. But it's getting specific and identifying like what it is that you want to do and getting specific like what is your art. And then needing help because it's impossible to do it by yourself.
Hi, Abby. I just think something I learned is like, don't be afraid to experiment. Like, the world is your oyster, really. Like, a piece of chewing gum on the ground could lead to an idea, and it may seem insane to other people, but I think even if you feel embarrassed, the art sort of like wants that from it. It's just like you have to push through the feelings of embarrassment and insecurity, of self-doubt, and just keep on with the work, because the work is a lifeline to you. It gives back to you as much as you give to it. And if you're generous with it, if you're patient with it, even if it drives you crazy, it will yield something to you in time. And so just bear with that process, even if it feels weird, like me. I don't know.
So will you give them a huge round of applause? Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.